March 2007, 6:14 a.m. Shenyang Aircraft Corporation Test Facility, northeastern China. The engine screamed. Not the deep, confident roar they were used to. Not the Saturn AL-31F they had spent decades perfecting back in Russia. This was something else, something thinner, something wrong. The two Russian engineers standing on the observation deck looked at each other, and one of them, a veteran test pilot who had logged over 2,000 hours in the Su-27, said something that would echo through the corridors of Russian defense intelligence for years. He said, "I am not flying that thing back to Moscow," and he meant it, because what was sitting on that runway, painted in the muted gray-green of the People's Liberation Army Air Force, looked exactly like the fighter jet that Russia considered one of the crown jewels of Soviet engineering. Same twin engines, same twin vertical stabilizers, same sweeping delta wings, same iconic fuselage stinger trailing behind the aircraft like the tail of a scorpion. But under the skin, in the cockpit, in the radar housing, in the engine bays, something fundamental had changed. China had taken Russia's most prized fourth-generation fighter and rebuilt it, without permission, without payment, and without telling Moscow a single word. This is the story of how one fighter jet became the most expensive mistake in modern arms dealing history, and how it revealed something deeply uncomfortable about the future of military technology. If this story blows your mind, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. We are just getting started, and trust me, what happens next is going to change the way you think about who controls the skies. To understand how we got to that freezing morning in Shenyang, we have to go back almost 3 decades. We have to go back to a time when the Soviet Union was falling apart, Russia was desperate for cash, and China was watching very, very carefully for its moment. It starts in 1969. The Soviet Union issues a requirement for a new heavy fighter, something big, something fast, something that could go toe-to-toe with the American F-15 Eagle and the F-14 Tomcat, the two most advanced air superiority fighters in the world at that time. The United States had spent billions developing those aircraft, and Washington knew something the Pentagon counted on. If the Soviets could not match that capability, American pilots would own the sky over Europe and the Pacific. So the Soviet government turns to one of the most legendary names in aviation history, Sukhoi. The Sukhoi Design Bureau, based in Moscow, had been building fighter aircraft since World War II. Pavel Sukhoi himself had started as a young engineer under Tupolev in the 1920s. The Design Bureau carried his name long after his death in 1975. And in the late 60s and early 70s, a team of engineers under general designer Mikhail Simonov began working on what would eventually become the Su-27. But the development was brutal. The first prototype, designated the T-10, flew for the first time on May 20, 1977. And it was, by most accounts, a disaster. The aerodynamics were wrong, the engines were wrong, the systems were wrong. Simonov himself later told reporters, with a half-smile that suggested he was not entirely joking, that by the time they finished redesigning the aircraft, just the tires and the pilot's seat from the original prototype remained. Everything else had been stripped away and rebuilt from scratch. But here is the thing about Soviet engineers. They did not give up. They went back to the drawing board. They rebuilt the aircraft from the ground up under the designation T-10S. They worked through the 80s, through years of budget cuts, political upheaval, and the grinding pressure of the Cold War. And what they produced was something genuinely extraordinary. The Su-27 entered service with the Soviet Air Forces in 1984. And when the West finally got a close look at it, at the 1989 Paris Air Show, where test pilot Viktor Pugachev performed the now legendary Cobra maneuver, pitching the nose of the aircraft straight up past 90 degrees, the aviation world collectively dropped its jaw. This was not a copy. This was not an imitation. This was an original masterpiece of aeronautical engineering. The Su-27 could carry 10 air-to-air missiles. It had a range of over 1,800 miles. It could fly at Mach 235. Its twin Saturn AL-31F engines produced a combined thrust of over 55,000 pounds, making it the most powerful twin-engine operational fighter in the world. And its fly-by-wire control system, developed through years of painstaking research at TSAGI, the Central Aero Hydrodynamic Institute, gave it maneuverability that stunned Western pilots who finally got to fly against it. By the late 1980s, the Su-27 comprised 25% of the entire Soviet Air Force fleet. It set over 40 world records for altitude and takeoff speed. It was the pride of Soviet aviation, and it was never, ever supposed to be exported to China. But history does not always follow the plan. Here is what you need to understand about Russia in 1989. The Soviet Union was collapsing. The Berlin Wall came down in November. Communist governments across Eastern Europe were crumbling like dominoes. And inside Moscow, the economic situation was catastrophic. The military-industrial complex, a massive apparatus of 1,600 defense enterprises employing hundreds of thousands of workers, was hemorrhaging money. Orders from the Soviet military had dried up almost overnight. Factories that had churned out tanks, missiles, and fighter jets for decades were suddenly staring at empty order books. Russia needed cash, desperately, and the arms market was one of the few places where hard currency was still flowing. Now, the same year the wall fell, 1989, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev made a historic visit to Beijing. It was the first such visit in 30 years, and it was meant to end the bitter ideological split that had divided the two communist powers since the late 1950s. The Sino-Soviet split, as historians call it, had fractured the communist world for 3 decades. There had been border clashes. There had been mutual espionage. There had been decades of mutual hostility dressed up in ideological language. But now, with the Cold War ending and the Soviet Union on its knees, Gorbachev was in Beijing to rebuild the relationship. And quietly, behind closed doors, the conversation turned to weapons. In May of 1990, a Chinese military delegation traveled to the Soviet Union to look at advanced aircraft. They were shown the MiG-29. The Soviet handlers pushed hard for this one. It was lighter, cheaper, and China had a long history of buying and copying MiG designs going back to the 1950s. The MiG-29 made sense on paper, but the Chinese delegation was not interested. They had seen the Su-27 in the demonstrations, and they wanted it. They wanted it badly. The reasons were strategic and deeply calculated. The Su-27 had a combat radius of over 900 nautical miles, far greater than the MiG-29. It had a fly-by-wire control system that the MiG-29 lacked entirely. Its engines were more powerful and lasted longer. And, this was the key insight, the Su-27 had a large airframe, a platform, something that could be upgraded, modified, and rebuilt over time. China's military planners understood something that the Soviet handlers apparently did not. They were not just buying a fighter jet. They were buying a foundation on which to build their entire next generation of tactical aircraft. Negotiations began in the winter of 1990, and by the time the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist, on December 25, 1991, a deal had been struck. 24 Su-27 SK and Su-27 UBK fighters, purchased by China for approximately $1 billion. The K in the designation stood for Kitai, the Russian word for China. President Boris Yeltsin honored the agreement. The first Su-27s were delivered to China on June 27, 1992, and based at Wuhu Air Base, 250 kilometers west of Shanghai. But China was not finished, not by a long shot. Now here is where it gets interesting, and here is where you need to pay very close attention, because what happens in the next few years is one of the most audacious and consequential acts of military espionage in the modern era, and almost no one saw it coming. Yeltsin visited Beijing in December of 1992. Russia was in economic freefall. The shock therapy reforms had devastated the middle class. Yeltsin himself, at a press conference in Beijing, looked at the thriving Chinese economy with barely concealed envy and said, "China is one of the most solvent countries in the world. We will be able to provide China with the best technology and equipment." He meant it. Russia needed the money. China had the money. And in that moment, in that single devastating miscalculation, the seeds of the Su-27 crisis were planted. Because China did not just want to buy Su-27s. China wanted to build them. In 1995, after years of quiet but persistent negotiation in which China exploited Russia's economic desperation at every single turn, Beijing secured something extraordinary, a technology transfer agreement. Russia would license China to co-produce the Su-27 on Chinese soil. The aircraft would be designated the J-11, and under the terms of the deal, Russia would initially supply the aircraft in knockdown kit form, with China assembling them at the Shenyang Aircraft Corporation factory in northeastern China. Over time, the agreement allowed for gradually increasing local content. Up to 70% of the airframe could eventually be manufactured in China. The contract was for 200 aircraft. The total value was estimated at $2.2 billion. And here was the critical detail, the detail that Russia built into the agreement specifically to maintain leverage. The engines and the radar would always have to come from Russia. Those components were explicitly excluded from the local production agreement. China would assemble the airframes, yes, but the heart of the aircraft, the Saturn AL-31F engines, the N-01 radar system, those would be purchased from Russian suppliers indefinitely. It was a brilliant move on Moscow's part. It kept China dependent. It kept the money flowing to Russia. It kept the door open, or so Russia thought. The first J-11s rolled off the Shenyang production line in 1998. By 2000, 5 had been built. By 2003, another 20 had followed, and the quality was genuinely good. Russia did not object to local airframe parts. In fact, it quietly encouraged them because it reduced the complexity of the kits that CONAPO, the Komsomolsk-on-Amur Aviation Production Association, had to ship from Russia. The system was working, more or less, as designed. By 2006, at least 105 J-11s and J-11As had been produced. Some carried upgraded domestic avionics. Some had improved cockpit displays. Russia grumbled a little, but the money was still flowing, and China was still buying Russian engines and radars. Everything seemed fine, but what was happening inside the Shenyang Aircraft Corporation, behind closed doors, in laboratories and workshops that no Russian inspector ever visited, was something entirely different. China was taking the Su-27 apart, piece by piece, system by system, and it was studying every single component with the precision of surgeons performing an autopsy on the most important aircraft in the world. You have to understand the context of what China was doing, because it was not random, it was not opportunistic, it was a decades-long national strategy. China had a long history of copying Soviet military hardware. Going back to the late 1950s, when the Sino-Soviet split began, China had been forced to develop its own military technology, or steal it. The J-7 fighter was a Chinese copy of the Soviet MiG-21. The A-5 attack aircraft was derived from Soviet designs. Tanks, artillery, missiles, nearly all of it traced back to Soviet originals from the 50s and 60s. China's military-industrial complex had been built in large part on the foundation of Soviet technology transfer and reverse engineering. So when China signed the Su-27 deal in the early 90s, the engineers at Shenyang were not starting from zero. They had decades of experience taking apart Soviet aircraft and rebuilding them. They knew how Soviet systems worked. They understood Soviet engineering philosophy, and they understood something else. Something that would prove to be the single most important strategic insight in this entire story. They understood that the Su-27's weakest link, at least from China's perspective, was its dependence on Russian engines and Russian radars. As long as China needed those components from Moscow, China was vulnerable. If Russia decided to cut off the supply, for political reasons, for economic leverage, for any reason at all, China's entire Su-27 fleet would be grounded. No engines meant no flying, no radar meant no combat capability. China's Air Force was, in a very real sense, held hostage by Moscow. And so the decision was made, at the highest levels of Chinese military planning, to eliminate that dependence. Completely. Permanently. The project began in the late 90s, years before China officially cancelled the Su-27 contract. Chinese engineers began studying the AL-31F engine in extraordinary detail. They began developing their own radar systems. They began designing indigenous avionics, weapon systems, and electronic countermeasures. And they did all of this while continuing to assemble J-11s from Russian kits, right on schedule, right on budget, giving Moscow absolutely no reason to be suspicious. It was, by any measure, a masterclass in strategic deception. But here is the part of the story that most people get wrong, and it is a critical distinction because it changes everything about how you understand what happened next. China did not simply copy the Su-27 and call it a day. What the engineers at Shenyang were doing was far more sophisticated than that. They were using the Su-27 as a launching pad, a platform, from which to develop something genuinely new, something better, at least in some ways. The radar, for example. The original Su-27 flew with the N-01 pulse Doppler radar, a system that was already obsolete by the time China got its hands on the aircraft. Russia had offered upgrades, but those upgrades came with strings. More Russian components, more Russian dependency, more money flowing to Moscow. So China developed its own. The Type 1493 radar, which replaced the NWS-001 on the J-11B, could reportedly detect enemy fighters at a range of over 90 miles and surface warships at over 200 miles. It was, by most assessments, a significant improvement over the original Russian system. The cockpit was entirely new, a full-glass cockpit with heads-up displays replacing the aging analog instruments of the Su-27 SK, an onboard oxygenator system to keep pilots conscious during high-G maneuvers. A missile approach warning system. These were all Chinese-designed, Chinese-built systems that represented genuine technological progress. The weapon suite was different too. The J-11B was designed to fire Chinese-made missiles. The PL-8 infrared-guided missile, itself derived from the Israeli Python III, and the PL-12 radar-guided missile, sometimes called the Chinese AMRAAM, with a range of up to 100 kilometers. A range of air-to-ground munitions was added: anti-radar missiles, laser-guided bombs, glide bombs. The 30mm GSH-30 cannon from the original Su-27 was retained, but everything else was new. So the J-11B was not just a copy, it was an evolution, a hybrid, a machine that took the bones of the Su-27 and grafted Chinese technology onto them in ways that, in several respects, surpassed the original. But there was one system, one critical, irreplaceable system, that China could not get right, and it would haunt the entire program for years. The engine, the WS-10 Taihang, say that name, and in the world of military aviation, it carries a weight of reputation that no amount of propaganda can erase. Because the WS-10 was for a long time one of the biggest failures in Chinese military technology. And the story of why it failed tells you something profound about the gap between copying an aircraft and truly understanding how to build one. The WS-10 program traces its origins back to 1986, when Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping personally ordered the development of an indigenous turbofan engine capable of matching the performance of the Russian Saturn AL-31F. The work was given to the Shenyang Aero Engine Research Institute, known as the 606 Institute, under the Aviation Industry Corporation of China. The engineers had a reference point. In 1982, China had acquired CFM-56 engines from the United States, commercial turbofans made by a joint venture between General Electric and Safran. These were civilian engines, not military ones, but they contained a core that derived from the GE F-101, the engine that powered the American F-16 Fighting Falcon. Chinese engineers studied that core. They studied the AL-31F that came with their Su-27s, and they tried to synthesize what they learned into something new. It took them over 2 decades. The original WS-10 was a failure. It could not produce enough thrust. It could not maintain reliability. The engineering team went back and developed the WS-10A, an improved version with full authority digital engine control. By 2005, it had achieved design freeze and production certification. On paper, it was ready. In reality, it was catastrophic. The first regiment of J-11Bs powered by WS-10A engines was converted in 2007. And almost immediately the problems began. The engines were failing, not occasionally, chronically. The mean time between overhauls dropped to approximately 30 hours. 30 hours. The Russian AL-31F that the WS-10A was supposed to replace had a mean time between overhauls of 400 hours. That is a difference of more than 13 times. The engines were overheating. Turbine blades were cracking. There were reports, unconfirmed but persistent, of oil leaks, and even rumors of at least one J-11BS fighter destroying itself during ground testing. In April 2009, the director of AVIC, China's state aviation authority, Lin Zoming, publicly admitted that there were problems with the quality control procedures on the WS-10A production line. He declined to elaborate, but the damage was already done. The entire first batch of J-11Bs with WS-10A engines was rejected by the People's Liberation Army Air Force. Rejected. Every single one. They were pulled from service and refitted with Russian AL-31F engines. The entire regiment was grounded. And here is the part that would have made Russian engineers laugh, if the situation were not so deeply embarrassing for everyone involved. China had built a fighter jet specifically to eliminate its dependence on Russian engines. And in doing so, it had proven conclusively that it still needed Russian engines. The very act of trying to cut the cord had demonstrated how tightly the cord was wound. But wait, before you conclude that this was simply a story of Chinese failure, you need to understand something else. Because the engine crisis was not just a technical problem, it was a symptom of something much larger, a fundamental gap in China's industrial capability that had nothing to do with intelligence or ambition and everything to do with time. Building a modern turbofan engine is not like assembling an aircraft. An aircraft is, in many ways, a systems integration challenge. You take wings, a fuselage, engines, avionics, and you put them together. You can copy the design. You can reverse engineer the components. An engine, however, is a different beast entirely. An engine operates at temperatures exceeding 1,400 degrees Celsius. It spins at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute. The turbine blades inside it must be made of exotic alloys, single crystal superalloys, grown under extraordinarily precise conditions. A single imperfect crystal structure, a single microscopic flaw in the metallurgy, and the blade shatters. And when a turbine blade shatters at those speeds, at those temperatures, inside a sealed housing, the results are catastrophic. The Americans spent over 12 years developing prototypes of the F-119 engine, the engine that powers the F-22 Raptor, in the 1980s. They then spent another 14 years of testing after the engine's maiden flight in 1997. Pratt & Whitney and General Electric poured billions of dollars into that program, and even they encountered failures along the way. China had none of that experience, none of that institutional knowledge, none of that decades-long tradition of incremental engine development that existed in the United States, in Russia, in France, and in Britain. China was trying to leapfrog from a position of near-zero experience in high-performance turbofan manufacturing to the absolute cutting edge of military engine technology, and it was trying to do it in a decade. The WS-10A's problems were not a sign of incompetence. They were a sign of how extraordinarily difficult the problem actually was. But Russia did not care about that distinction. Russia cared about one thing. China had stolen its fighter jet, and now China was flying it, or trying to fly it, without paying Moscow a dime. So let us talk about what happened when Russia found out. The exact moment when Moscow first realized the full extent of what China was doing is classified and probably always will be, but the timeline is clear. By 2004, intelligence reports were reaching the Russian Foreign Ministry that Shenyang Aircraft Corporation was developing a variant of the J-11 with fully indigenous systems, Chinese radar, Chinese avionics, Chinese weapons, and Chinese engines. A variant that did not require a single Russian component. A variant that violated the co-production agreement in every meaningful way. Russia's response was immediate, and it was surgical. In 2004, the Russian Foreign Ministry blocked the sale of two aircraft to China, the Su-35, a significantly upgraded version of the Su-27, and the Tu-22M strategic bomber. Both sales had been under discussion for months. Both were abruptly terminated. The official reason given was vague. Concerns about arrangements for Chinese production of the Su-27, but everyone in the defense establishment understood exactly what it meant. Russia was punishing China, quietly, precisely, without making a public scene that would embarrass both governments, but punishing them nonetheless. The effect was dramatic. From 2000 to 2006, Chinese military imports from Russia dropped from $3.2 billion per year to virtually zero. The arms pipeline, the single most important economic relationship between the two countries, dried up almost overnight. And then, in 2007, China did something extraordinary, something bold, something that confirmed every fear Moscow had. China put the J-11B on state television, not on a classified briefing, not in a leaked photograph, on CCTV, China's state broadcaster, in prime time. They showed the aircraft. They showed it flying. They showed it armed with Chinese missiles, equipped with Chinese radar, powered by Chinese engines. They showed it to the world, and they showed it to Russia. The message was unmistakable. We have done it. We have built your fighter jet without you, and there is nothing you can do about it. Now imagine you are a senior engineer at the Sukhoi Design Bureau in Moscow. You have spent your career working on the Su-27. You helped design it. You helped test it. You watched test pilots risk their lives bringing it to life. And now you are watching on Chinese state television A copy of your life's work, fly over Chinese soil, powered by Chinese engines, carrying Chinese missiles, and bearing absolutely no trace of the Russian technology that made it possible. How do you feel? Angry does not begin to cover it. Russian officials spoke privately, and sometimes publicly, about intellectual property litigation, about legal action, about demanding compensation. Vasily Kashin, a Russian expert on the Chinese military, captured the mood with brutal honesty when he said, "When the license was sold, everyone knew they would do this. It was just a risk that was taken. At that time, it was a question of survival. Survival." That one word tells you everything about why Russia made the deals it made. Moscow was not being naive. The engineers at Sukhoi were not ignorant of the risks. They understood perfectly well that China had a track record of copying Soviet technology. They understood that the Su-27 would likely end up being reverse-engineered. They understood all of it. But in 1992, Russia was starving. The economy was in freefall. Factories were closing. Workers were not being paid. And the Su-27 deal, worth over $1 billion, was one of the few sources of hard currency available. It was not a choice between selling the Su-27 and keeping it safe. It was a choice between selling the Su-27 and watching the Russian defense industry collapse entirely. Sergei Sergeyev, Deputy Director General of Sukhoi, put it most memorably. He said, "It's one thing to make a good quality copy of a spoon, but quite another to make one of an aircraft." He was right. And for a while, everyone believed that China would prove his point, that the complexity of a modern fighter jet was simply beyond the capability of Chinese industry to replicate. The WS-10 engine disaster seemed to confirm that belief. China could copy the airframe. China could reverse engineer the radar. But the engine, the heart of the machine, that was where the copy would break down. And for a time, it did. But Russia had underestimated something. It had underestimated the sheer determination of the Chinese state when it decided to solve a problem. It had underestimated the resources China was willing to pour into engine development. And it had underestimated how much time China was willing to spend. The WS-10 story did not end in 2009 with the grounding of the first J-11B regiment. It continued, year after year. The engineers at the 606 Institute went back to work. They studied the failures. They improved the metallurgy. They developed new turbine blade manufacturing techniques. They invested hundreds of billions of yuan. The Chinese government committed roughly 150 billion RMB, approximately $23.7 billion, to aero-engine advancement between 2010 and 2015 alone. By 2009, the improved WS-10A was reportedly mature enough to power the J-11B Block 02, a new production batch of the aircraft. By 2014, Jane's Defense Weekly confirmed the J-11B was operational with WS-10 engines. By 2018, Chinese state media reported that engine lifespan had increased from 800 hours to 1,500 hours, thanks to the development of third-generation single-crystal turbine blades. It was not perfect. It was not yet equal to the AL-31F in every respect. But it was functional. It was reliable enough. And it was entirely, completely, 100% Chinese. And here is the number that should make every defense planner in the world sit up and take notice. By 2012, the number of J-11B and J-11BS aircraft in service with the Chinese military exceeded 120. By some estimates, 253 aircraft of all J-11 variants had been built by the mid-2010s. China had not just copied the Su-27, it had mass-produced it. It had created an entire family of derivatives, the J-11BH for the Navy, the J-11BS twin-seater for training, the J-11BG with upgraded AESA radar, and eventually the J-11D, which incorporated increased composite materials and a new fly-by-wire control system. And then China did something else, something that went even further. It took the Su-33, the carrier-based variant of the Su-27, designed for operation from Russian aircraft carriers, and turned it into the J-15 Flying Shark. Russia had refused to sell China even two Su-33s. China had purchased a single prototype from Ukraine in 2001, a non-functional demonstrator, and reverse-engineered it. By 2012, two J-15s performed their first landing on the carrier Liaoning. China had not just copied one fighter jet, it had copied an entire family, a lineage, a dynasty of aircraft, all descending from the Su-27, all now flying under Chinese flags, all carrying Chinese weapons, all independent of Moscow. So let us return to that morning in Shenyang, March 2007. The Russian engineers on the observation deck watching the J-11B power up on the runway. The engine screaming in a way that was not quite right. The aircraft that looked like their Su-27 but was not. Not anymore. Not really. The senior test pilot said he would not fly it back to Moscow. And when you think about what he meant by that, really think about it, you realize it was not just a statement about the aircraft's reliability. It was a statement about what that aircraft represented. It was a statement about what had just happened to Russian military technology. It was a statement about the price of desperation and the cost of trust, and the terrible arithmetic of a world where survival sometimes means handing your most precious secrets to someone who will use them against you. But here is what makes this story more than just a tale of espionage and betrayal. Here is what makes it genuinely important, not just for military historians, but for anyone who wants to understand how the world works today. The J-11B crisis forced Russia to fundamentally rethink how it sold weapons. After 2004, Moscow adopted a new strategy: sell only complete systems, never license production. If China wanted Su-35s, Russia would build them in Russia and ship them complete. No kits, no technology transfer, no production line in China. The intellectual property agreement signed in December 2008 imposed explicit restrictions on Beijing's ability to export arms based on Russian designs. Russia became essentially a one-time seller rather than a technology licensor, and it worked to a degree. In 2013, after years of diplomatic maneuvering, Russia cleared the sale of Su-35s to China. 24 aircraft delivered complete, manufactured entirely in Russia. The deal was worth billions, but it came with conditions that the 1995 Su-27 deal had entirely lacked. And even then, Russian officials watched the transaction with nervous eyes because everyone remembered what had happened last time. The J-11B crisis also revealed something uncomfortable about the global arms market. China was not the only country watching what happened. Every nation that had ever purchased Russian military technology, or American, or French, or British, was paying attention. The message was clear: if you give a country access to your weapons technology, and that country has the industrial capability and the patience to reverse engineer it, they will. The contract will not stop them. The intellectual property agreement will not stop them. The only thing that will stop them is if the technology is so complex, so deeply embedded in institutional knowledge and decades of incremental development that it simply cannot be replicated by copying alone. And that brings us to the deepest lesson of the Su-27 story. The lesson that cuts right to the heart of where military power is going, not just for China and Russia, but for the entire world. Aircraft can be copied, radar systems can be reverse engineered, missiles can be replicated. But the real competitive advantage in modern warfare is not the hardware. It is not the metal and the carbon fiber and the silicon. It is the knowledge. The accumulated institutional, generational knowledge of how to build things at the absolute edge of human capability. China could copy the Su-27's airframe because an airframe is, in the end, a structure. It can be measured, it can be photographed, it can be reproduced with sufficient precision using computer-aided design and modern manufacturing techniques. The same is true of most electronic systems. Given enough time and enough talent, you can reverse engineer a radar or a flight computer. But an engine is different. An engine is not just a design, it is a process. It is a manufacturing capability that has been refined over decades, over generations, of trial and error, failure and recovery. It is knowledge that exists not just in blueprints, but in the hands and minds of thousands of engineers who have spent their careers working on that specific problem. And that kind of knowledge cannot be stolen. It cannot be photographed. It cannot be reverse engineered from a single specimen. It can only be built, slowly, painfully, through years of failure. And that is exactly what China did. It took nearly 20 years, from the first WS-10 prototypes in the late 90s to the mature WS-10B of the mid-2010s, to close the gap. 20 years of grinding, unglamorous work. 20 years of failed turbine blades and grounded aircraft and embarrassing public admissions of quality control failures. 20 years of pouring money, billions and billions of dollars, into a single problem. But they closed it. Not all the way, not perfectly, but close enough to matter, close enough to change the strategic calculus in the Western Pacific. close enough to make the J-11B and its descendants a genuine threat to Taiwan, to the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, and to American air superiority in the region. The J-11B was never meant to be a wonder weapon. It was never meant to be the most advanced fighter in the world. It was meant to be good enough. It was meant to be available in large numbers. It was meant to be cheap enough to produce in quantity. And it was meant to be entirely self-sufficient. No Russian engines, no Russian radar, no Russian anything. On all of those counts, China succeeded. Consider the numbers. By 2014, a J-11B intercepted a U.S. Navy P-8 Poseidon anti-submarine warfare aircraft over the South China Sea, passing within 20 feet of the American plane. 20 feet. In April 2014, 16 J-11Bs were deployed to Woody Island in the South China Sea, provoking a diplomatic protest from Vietnam. In November 2022, when President Biden visited Asia, China sent 14 aircraft, including 4 J-11s, into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. Taiwan had to scramble its interceptors. These were not accidents. These were deliberate demonstrations of capability. China was showing the world, and showing Taiwan, that its air force was no longer dependent on foreign technology, that it could project power in the Western Pacific on its own terms, and that the aircraft it was flying, aircraft built on the bones of a Russian design, but transformed into something fundamentally Chinese, were real. They were capable, and they were here to stay. But the story of the Su-27 and the J-11B is not just about China's success. It is also about what it cost. What it cost Russia, what it cost the relationship between Moscow and Beijing, and what it cost the global arms market. Russia lost more than a fighter jet. It lost credibility. For years after the J-11B crisis, other potential customers of Russian military equipment looked at the Su-27 deal and asked themselves, if China could do this to Russia, what does that mean for the security of the technology I am buying? India, Russia's other major arms customer, began looking harder at indigenous development programs. Other countries began diversifying their suppliers. The Su-27 scandal became a cautionary tale in every defense procurement office in the world. And inside Russia, the crisis triggered a painful reckoning. Russian defense officials began asking questions that should have been asked years earlier. How much of our military technology can be copied? How do we protect it? How do we sell weapons without giving away the ability to replicate them? These were not new questions, but the J-11B made them urgent in a way they had not been before. Vasily Kashin, the Russian military expert we quoted earlier, put it bluntly. When the license was sold, everyone knew they would do this. Everyone knew. And Russia did it anyway. Because in 1992, survival mattered more than security. Because the alternative to selling the Su-27 was not some comfortable fallback position. The alternative was the collapse of the Russian defense industry, the unemployment of hundreds of thousands of workers, the end of Russia as a military power of any consequence. So Russia made the deal, and it paid the price. Now here is something that most people miss entirely, something that complicates the narrative in a way that is deeply uncomfortable for both sides. Something that makes this story not just about China stealing from Russia, but about the strange, twisted logic of how military technology moves through the world. China did not just copy the Su-27, it improved it. In several meaningful ways, the J-11B was a better aircraft than the Su-27SK it was derived from. Better radar, better cockpit, better weapons, lighter airframe with more composite materials, more advanced electronic warfare systems. And here is the uncomfortable part. Some of those improvements, the ones that made the J-11B genuinely superior to its Russian ancestor, were things that Russia itself had not bothered to implement on the Su-27SK, because Russia was already working on the Su-35 and the Su-57. Russia had moved on. The Su-27SK was, from Moscow's perspective, an aging platform. A workhorse, certainly, but not the future. China took that aging platform and made it better. Not because China was more talented than Russian engineers, but because China was focused. Because China had a specific problem to solve, defending Taiwan, projecting power in the South China Sea, and it tailored the aircraft to that specific mission. It added the systems that mattered. It removed the systems that did not. And it did it all without asking Moscow for permission. This is what modern military-industrial espionage looks like. It is not crude, it is not clumsy, it is surgical, it is patient, and it produces results that in some cases surpass the original. So where does that leave us? Where does the Su-27 story end? It does not end. That is the truth. The Su-27 is still flying. It is flying in Russia, where upgraded variants like the Su-30SM and Su-35S continue to serve. It was flying in Ukraine, where Su-27s fought desperately against Russian air forces after the February 2022 invasion, and where the last Ukrainian Su-27s were eventually destroyed or worn out. It is flying in China, where the J-11B and its descendants form the backbone of the PLAF's air superiority capability. And the engine problem that nearly sank the entire J-11B program? It is still being worked on. The WS-10B and WS-10C represent significant improvements over the original WS-10A. China has invested enormous resources, hundreds of billions of yuan, in closing the remaining gaps. The WS-15 engine, intended for the J-20 stealth fighter, is supposedly nearing maturity. When it arrives, if it arrives, it will represent something that China has never had before, a truly world-class fifth-generation turbofan engine, designed and built entirely in China. And that is perhaps the most important takeaway from the entire Su-27 story. Not that China stole a fighter jet, not that Russia was cheated, but that the act of copying, painful, expensive, humiliating as it was, forced China to develop capabilities it never would have developed otherwise. The WS-10 program, for all its failures, taught Chinese engineers more about turbofan engine design than any textbook ever could. It taught them what did not work. It taught them where the hard problems were. It taught them the difference between knowing a design and understanding a design. And now China is building on that foundation, not copying anymore, building, developing, creating the J-20, the J-35. The next generation of Chinese fighters that will have no Russian DNA whatsoever, no Su-27 ancestry, no Soviet heritage. Aircraft that will be, for the first time in Chinese history, entirely original. The Su-27 was the seed. The J-11B was the first sprout. And what is growing now? What is coming? Maybe something that neither Russia nor the West fully anticipated. Go back to that morning in Shenyang, March 2007. The Russian test pilot on the observation deck, watching the J-11B power up. The engines screaming wrong. The aircraft that looked like his Su-27 but was not. He said he would not fly it back to Moscow. He was right not to. Not because the aircraft was dangerous, though at that point it probably was. The WS-10A engines were failing. The systems were unreliable. Flying it across the vast distances between Shenyang and Moscow, over the Mongolian steppe, over Siberia, thousands of kilometers of unforgiving terrain with no place to land if something went wrong, would have been genuinely reckless. But there was something else behind his refusal, something deeper, something that had nothing to do with engine reliability and everything to do with what that aircraft represented. Because flying the J-11B back to Moscow would have meant accepting it, accepting what it was, accepting what China had done, accepting that the Su-27, his aircraft, his life's work, the machine that had defined Soviet aviation for a generation, had become something else, something Chinese, something that no longer belonged to Russia. And that was a truth that no Russian engineer, no matter how pragmatic, no matter how clear-eyed about the realities of geopolitics and arms sales, was ready to accept on that cold morning in March. The Su-27 was built by Russian hands. It was perfected by Russian minds. It was the product of decades of Soviet engineering, of sacrifice, of dedication, of brilliant minds working under crushing pressure in a system that did not always reward brilliance, but that, in this case, produced something genuinely extraordinary. And now it flies under Chinese wings. That is the story. That is the truth. And that truth, uncomfortable as it is, tells us something vital about the world we live in. A world where technology does not stay in one place. A world where borders do not stop information. A world where the most sophisticated weapon systems in history can be reverse-engineered, copied, improved upon, and turned into the foundation of an entirely new military-industrial capability in less than 2 decades. The Russians built the Su-27, the Chinese built the J-11B, and the world of military technology, of strategic competition, of the great power rivalry that will define the 21st century, will never be the same. The test pilot was right. He should not have flown it back to Moscow, because Moscow had already lost something it could never get back. Not the aircraft, not the technology, not even the money. It had lost the assumption that its military secrets were safe, and that assumption, once broken, can never be repaired. That is the story of the Su-27 and the J-11B, one of the most consequential, most audacious, and most instructive acts of military technology transfer, willing or otherwise, in the history of modern warfare. A story that begins with Soviet genius, passes through Russian desperation, and ends, for now, with Chinese ambition stretching toward the horizon. If you made it this far, if this story meant something to you, hit that like button, subscribe, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because this is not just a story about fighter jets. It is a story about power, about patience, about the price of survival, and about what happens when the most advanced military technology in the world meets the most determined industrial nation on Earth. The Su-27 was Russian, the J-11B is Chinese, and the future belongs to whoever builds the next one best.